What if the most influential mind in basketball right now doesn't play in the NBA? Not a former MVP, not a Hall of Famer, not even someone in the league. And yet somehow, when she speaks, the entire basketball world listens. This isn't hype. It isn't social media noise. And it's definitely not just another feel-good media moment. What we're watching unfold is something much bigger, a quiet power shift happening in plain sight. Because when NBC decided to relaunch Sunday Night Basketball, they had dozens of safe options. Retired champions, established analysts, familiar voices. The usual formula that networks rely on when billions of dollars are on the line. But instead, they put Caitlin Clark at the center of it. Prime time, Madison Square Garden, Lakers versus Knicks, Hall of Fame legends sitting beside her. That wasn't random. That wasn't experimental. That was deliberate. And here's where it gets uncomfortable for some people. This wasn't about women's basketball. It wasn't about diversity optics. It wasn't even just about ratings. It was about influence. Because over the last 2 years, Caitlin Clark hasn't just been playing basketball. She's been bending the sport around her. She turned regular season college games into national events. She made casual fans set alarms. She made streaming platforms spike in subscribers overnight. She made arenas sell out in cities that had never seen that kind of demand before. And now, she's stepping into NBA territory. Not as a guest, not as a cameo, but as a voice shaping the conversation. Some executives see opportunity. Some players see respect. And some insiders, they see something else entirely. Because if one athlete can command this much attention across 2 leagues, what does that say about who really drives the game now? And the numbers behind this story? They're not just impressive. They're disruptive. But before we get to NBC's strategy, before we talk about sneaker deals and boardroom decisions, we need to look at the earthquake that started all of this. Because the ratings weren't just good. They were historic. And that's where everything changed. The moment Caitlin Clark crossed half court and pulled up from the logo in college, something shifted. It wasn't just a highlight. It was a signal. Because people didn't just react, they leaned in. At first, analysts treated it like a hot streak, a flashy scorer riding momentum, the kind of viral athlete who burns bright for a season and fades once the defenses adjust. But then the numbers started coming in. Regular season Iowa games were pulling viewership that most programs could only dream about. Not just for women's basketball, for college basketball overall. Ticket demand exploded. Secondary markets surged. Opposing arenas started moving games to larger venues just to accommodate the crowds she was drawing. That doesn't happen for good players. That happens for cultural events. And then came the tournament run. What unfolded during that NCAA stretch wasn't just impressive. It rewrote expectations. Games featuring Clark didn't just lead ratings charts for women's basketball. They rivaled, and in some cases outperformed, major men's matchups. Let that sink in. In a sports landscape where the men's tournament has dominated attention for decades, a single player flipped the script. Viewers who had never watched a women's game before suddenly had strong opinions. Social media clips were spreading at algorithm-breaking speed. Casual fans were debating defensive coverages like seasoned analysts. And here's what really matters. Those viewers didn't disappear. When she declared for the WNBA draft, it didn't feel like a procedural step. It felt like the next episode of a series people were already invested in. Draft night turned into primetime programming. Merchandise dropped and immediately sold out. Ticket sales for Indiana Fever games surged before she had even played a professional minute. And once she stepped onto a WNBA court, the ripple effect became undeniable. Television ratings for games she played in weren't slightly higher. They were multiples higher. Attendance figures climbed dramatically across the league, not just in Indiana. Opposing teams reported their highest home crowds of the season when she was in the building. Even road games became events. Broadcasters began adjusting scheduling priorities. Networks quietly recalibrated expectations. Sponsors leaned in harder. Because this wasn't incremental growth. This was acceleration. And here's where things get even more interesting. When NBC placed one of her record-breaking college games behind a streaming paywall, something unusual happened. People subscribed. Not out of loyalty to the platform. Not because of bundled packages, but specifically to watch her. In an era where consumers resist adding new subscriptions, that kind of conversion rate is almost unheard of. Executives notice patterns like that. They study them. They model them. Because it tells them something powerful. It tells them this athlete isn't just drawing eyeballs. She's driving behavior. And that's the rarest currency in media. Meanwhile, traditional NBA regular season ratings have been navigating a complicated landscape. Fragmented audiences, streaming competition, shifting viewing habits, shorter attention spans. The league is still massive, still dominant, still culturally relevant. But consistency, that's harder. And when one player, not even in the NBA, begins producing must-watch energy that cuts across demographics, that doesn't go unnoticed. Younger viewers? Locked in. Longtime basketball purists? Curious. Casual fans? Engaged. She bridges audiences most networks struggle to connect. But ratings alone don't change power structures. Influence does. And influence is what NBC saw forming in real time. Because when one athlete can command millions across platforms, across leagues, across conversations, you're no longer just covering the sport. You're reshaping it. And that's exactly why NBC didn't treat her like a guest. They treated her like a cornerstone. But the ratings explosion was only the beginning. Because once the numbers proved she could move markets, the real strategy started. And that's where this story takes a turn most people didn't see coming. NBC didn't take a chance on Caitlin Clark. They ran the numbers. And the numbers made the decision for them. Because here's the reality most legacy sports networks don't like admitting out loud. Their core audience is aging. The viewers who grew up with appointment television, who tuned in every Sunday without fail, who watched full pregame shows instead of highlight clips. That generation is loyal. But it isn't growing. Meanwhile, the younger audience, the one advertisers are fighting for, doesn't consume sports the same way. They don't sit through 30-minute analysis segments just because a familiar theme song plays. They scroll. They clip. They react. They follow personalities more than programming. They want authenticity. They want energy. They want someone who feels current. And Caitlin Clark checks every one of those boxes. She's not just a basketball player. She's an algorithm magnet. Her highlights don't just get views. They dominate feeds. Her interviews don't feel rehearsed. They feel real. Her competitive fire doesn't feel manufactured. It feels instinctive. NBC understands something that many networks are still catching up to. In modern sports media, personalities drive platforms, not the other way around. When NBC regained NBA rights as part of the league's massive long-term media deal, they weren't just relaunching a broadcast. They were relaunching relevance. And they had two options. Option 1, lean into nostalgia. Bring back familiar faces. Recreate the early 2000s energy. Hope the audience feels sentimental enough to return. Option 2, signal a new era. They chose the second. Madison Square Garden wasn't random. Lakers versus Knicks wasn't random. Pairing her with Hall of Fame legends wasn't random. This was a statement. Because when you place a 22-year-old active WNBA star at the main desk on your first major NBA broadcast in over 2 decades, you're doing more than filling a seat. You're sending a message about who the future audience belongs to. And the optics were impossible to ignore. Bob Costas in the building. NBA icons in the mix. One of the most historic arenas in sports. And right there, Caitlin Clark. Not wide-eyed. Not overwhelmed. Not deferential. Composed. Comfortable. Belonging. That's what surprised people. Because skeptics expected nerves. They expected a learning curve. Instead, what they saw was command. She didn't speak like someone trying to prove herself. She spoke like someone who understood the moment. And here's what makes this move even sharper. NBC isn't just a broadcast company. It's part of Comcast. Comcast owns Xfinity. Caitlin Clark already has an endorsement relationship inside that ecosystem. That's not coincidence. That's corporate synergy at the highest level. When brands invest in athletes today, they're not just thinking about commercials. They're thinking about long-term brand alignment. She isn't just appearing on NBC. She's activating an entire network family. That means cross-promotion. That means streaming leverage. That means future broadcast flexibility. This wasn't a one-night appearance. It was infrastructure. And here's where it gets even more strategic. Think about what NBC gains from this alignment. They get a generational talent with massive organic reach, a younger demographic that might not otherwise tune in, a cross-league credibility, social media amplification built into every segment. Every time she trends, NBC trends. Every viral clip from the desk becomes free marketing. Every debate about her presence fuels engagement. And controversy? That only drives more clicks. Because let's be honest, there are people who think she's too early for this spotlight. There are critics who argue she hasn't earned a seat next to NBA legends. And NBC knows that debate fuels attention. Attention fuels ratings. Ratings fuel leverage. But here's the twist most viewers didn't catch. NBC didn't position her as a novelty. They positioned her as an equal. That's powerful. She wasn't there to talk about the WNBA. She was there to analyze the NBA, breaking down pick-and-roll reads, discussing defensive rotations, talking late-game execution. And the legends next to her? They nodded. They engaged. They listened. That visual alone shifts perception. Because once audiences see Hall of Famers respecting her basketball mind, the debate changes. She's no longer crossing over. She's participating. And that blurs lines. The NBA and WNBA have historically operated like parallel universes. Separate broadcasts, separate marketing strategies, separate audience pools. But NBC just built a bridge. And bridges create traffic. Traffic creates growth. But here's what executives really care about. Longevity. Caitlin Clark isn't a short-term spike. She's a sustained presence. Her college dominance wasn't a flash. Her WNBA impact wasn't a fluke. Her media comfort isn't accidental. She's media-trained without feeling scripted, confident without feeling arrogant, competitive without feeling hostile. That combination is rare. And in modern sports media, rare equals valuable. But something else happened that night, something subtle. The energy of the broadcast felt different. Faster, sharper, less recycled. Because when you add an active elite player to the desk, the analysis changes. It becomes current. It becomes tactical. It becomes layered. And that's where some insiders started whispering. Because if her insights start resonating more than traditional voices, what does that mean for the old model? Sports television has relied on a predictable formula for decades. Retired stars tell stories. Hosts guide segments. Highlights roll. But the modern viewer doesn't always want nostalgia. They want now. And Caitlin Clark is very much now. But here's the question that makes this even more fascinating. What happens when her analysis starts going viral the same way her jump shots did? What happens when fans tune in not just to watch the game, but to hear what she thinks about it? That's when influence shifts. And when influence shifts, power follows. Because this isn't just about one broadcast. It's about positioning. It's about narrative control. It's about who becomes the face of basketball conversation over the next decade. And NBC made it clear they believe that face includes Caitlin Clark. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The broadcast move was bold. The ratings were strong. The optics were powerful. But the real shock didn't come from the strategy. It came from what happened when she started breaking down the game. Because that's when the tone changed. And that's where the conversation moved from marketing to basketball intelligence. And that's a different level entirely. The room changed the moment she stopped being the story and started breaking down the game. Because it's one thing to draw ratings. It's another thing to command respect in a room full of basketball royalty. When Caitlin Clark began analyzing real-time NBA actions on that broadcast, something subtle happened. The conversation tightened. It got sharper, more technical, less surface level. And that's when critics got quiet. She wasn't offering generic takes. She wasn't repeating safe commentary. She was talking about weak-side defenders drifting too far off the nail. She was pointing out the timing of the backscreen before the flare action even fully developed. She was identifying why a guard rejected a screen before the replay package even loaded. That's not scripted insight. That's instinct. And NBA players notice instinct. Because elite basketball IQ has a sound to it. It's precise. It's fast. It doesn't hesitate. You either see the floor at that level, or you don't. And what startled some viewers wasn't that she understood the game. It was how easily she communicated it. No over-explaining. No rambling. Just clean reads. Confident delivery. Move on. That kind of processing speed isn't common. And it's definitely not something you fake on live television. Here's where things get interesting. Modern NBA offenses are built around spacing, pace, and decision-making in tight windows. High pick and roll. Weak side action. Corner gravity. Drive and kick sequences that unfold in half seconds. Guess what style Caitlin Clark plays? High-volume threes. Deep range that forces defensive extension. Transition tempo. Creative passing angles off the dribble. She operates in the same modern framework. That's why her analysis resonates. She's not studying this era from a distance. She's living it. And that's a different lens than retired legends who played under different rule interpretations, different spacing realities, and different defensive schemes. This isn't disrespect to the greats. It's context. Basketball evolves. And she speaks fluent 2020s basketball. There's a reason some NBA coaches privately admit they study her off-ball movement. There's a reason opposing WNBA defenders talk about her gravity. Because gravity translates. And when you understand gravity, you understand how to bend a defense without touching the ball. That's high-level basketball literacy. During her earlier Manning-cast-style appearance during the Final Four, she showed flashes of this comfort. But this was different. This was prime time. This was Madison Square Garden. This was legacy television. And she didn't shrink. She expanded. You could see it in the body language of the former NBA stars beside her. At first, polite engagement. Then curiosity. Then genuine back and forth. When a Hall of Famer starts asking you follow-up questions instead of talking over you, that's respect. And respect in basketball circles isn't handed out lightly. Now here's where the online debate started to heat up. Clips began circulating, not just of her speaking, but of the moments when former pros nodded along, when they paused and let her finish, when they responded seriously instead of brushing it off. Suddenly the comment sections weren't debating her popularity. They were debating her mind. Does she see the floor better than some current NBA guards? Is her anticipation elite across leagues? Could she break down an NBA defense better than half the analysts on TV? These are dangerous conversations in traditional basketball hierarchies. Because once fans start comparing IQ across leagues, the walls feel thinner. Now, to be clear, this isn't about claiming she's physically better than NBA players. That's not the conversation. The conversation is about processing speed, vision, decision-making, understanding space before it appears. And that's where it gets uncomfortable for some critics. Because basketball IQ doesn't scale strictly by league. You either read patterns at a high level, or you don't. She does. And she's proven it repeatedly. Think back to her college career. Defenses trapped her at half court, blitzed ball screens, switched length onto her. She adjusted in real time, split traps, manipulated help defenders with her eyes, delivered cross-court passes on a rope. That's advanced spatial awareness. Now place that brain on an NBA broadcast desk analyzing similar concepts. It works. It connects. And here's something even more intriguing. The modern fan doesn't just want highlights anymore. They want understanding. They want to feel smarter about the game. When someone breaks down a Spain pick and roll in a way that makes sense instantly, that builds loyalty. And loyalty builds audience. But the tension didn't stop there. Because once her analysis clips started trending, a new narrative emerged. Why does her breakdown feel fresher than some longtime analysts? That's when established media figures started paying attention. Because sports broadcasting is competitive. It's reputation-driven. It's visibility-based. And when a 22-year-old active player begins commanding that kind of attention on day one, that shakes comfort zones. Quietly. Subtly. Nobody says it directly. But the industry notices. And here's what makes this even more powerful. She doesn't come across as confrontational. She's not trying to dominate the desk. She's not forcing takes. She's simply prepared. And preparation exposes laziness. That's the part that stings. Because when someone new walks in and instantly elevates the level of conversation, it forces everyone else to level up, or risk looking outdated. Now imagine this dynamic continuing. More appearances, more viral clips, more moments where her basketball mind becomes the headline. At some point, the narrative shifts from special guest to core analyst. And once that happens, the line between leagues gets thinner again. Because now fans aren't just tuning in for nostalgia. They're tuning in for clarity. And clarity is addictive. But here's the part people really aren't ready for. If her analysis becomes must-watch content, if her voice starts shaping how younger fans understand the NBA, if her presence begins influencing how the sport is discussed, then we're no longer talking about a player crossing over into media. We're talking about someone influencing the sport's narrative architecture. And that's where this story stops being about ratings. and starts being about power. Because narrative control in sports is everything. It determines legacy. It shapes endorsement value. It influences perception. And Caitlin Clark is stepping directly into that space. But as this momentum builds, as her voice grows louder, as her presence becomes normalized on NBA platforms, there's another layer forming beneath the surface. A layer not everyone is comfortable acknowledging. Because influence isn't neutral. It shifts dynamics. It changes hierarchies. And when one athlete begins commanding attention across two leagues simultaneously, people start asking different questions. Not about whether she belongs, but about what this means long-term. And that's where the tension really begins. Because this next part, it's the one nobody wants to say out loud. Here's the part that rarely gets said directly. Influence is a limited resource. There's only so much attention in sports. Only so many headlines. Only so many primetime slots. And when one person starts absorbing more of that spotlight than expected, the ecosystem shifts. Caitlin Clark isn't just trending inside women's basketball anymore. She's trending inside NBA conversations. That's new territory. And when territory changes, people feel it. Now, no one is publicly complaining. You won't see NBA stars going on record saying they're threatened. That's not how this works. But privately, the conversation is different. Because players understand leverage. They understand brand value. They understand the power of controlling narrative. And when a 22-year-old WNBA guard begins driving more consistent engagement than some established NBA All-Stars during the regular season, that gets noticed. Let's talk numbers for a second. Certain nationally televised NBA matchups struggle to create viral traction unless they involve the biggest superstars. But a single Caitlin Clark highlight? It can dominate feeds for 48 hours. That's disproportionate engagement. And engagement equals influence. Now imagine being a mid-tier NBA star. You've been in the league for 7 years. You average 22 a game. You're respected. You grind. But your post-game interview gets 80,000 views. Meanwhile, a Clark pregame analysis clip hits 3 million. That doesn't mean she's better. It means she's commanding oxygen. And in professional sports, oxygen matters. Because endorsement deals are oxygen. Media slots are oxygen. Signature shoes are oxygen. Speaking of shoes, let's address the speculation that's been quietly building. Nike has been unusually quiet about her signature release timeline. Almost too quiet. Normally, in today's marketing cycle, leaks happen. Teasers drop. Sneaker blogs buzz months in advance. But with her, it's controlled, strategic, and insiders believe there's a reason. Imagine unveiling a signature shoe not during a WNBA game, but on a national NBA broadcast. Madison Square Garden. Millions watching. Legends on set. That's not just a shoe drop. That's a statement. It says, this athlete transcends categories. It says, this brand sees long-term dominance. And if that reveal happens in that setting, it would be one of the boldest cross-league marketing plays in modern basketball. Now step back and look at the bigger picture. She's not just building a playing career. She's building parallel power. That's rare. Most athletes follow a linear path. Play first. Media later. Build brand after retirement. But Caitlin Clark is collapsing timelines. She's doing both simultaneously. And that's disruptive. Because it changes what young athletes will expect moving forward. Why wait until you retire to own the narrative? Why not build the platform while you're still performing? That mindset pressures the old system. It pressures traditional broadcasting hierarchies. It pressures how leagues structure visibility. And here's where some critics try to downplay it. They say it's hype. They say it's novelty. They say it's temporary. But temporary doesn't move corporate infrastructure. Temporary doesn't shift billion-dollar broadcast strategies. Temporary doesn't realign cross-network endorsement synergies. NBC didn't make this move because it felt good. They made it because it made sense. But sense for NBC doesn't automatically mean comfort for everyone else. Because when one athlete becomes the bridge between leagues, that bridge reroutes traffic. Suddenly NBA fans are tuning in to hear her perspective. WNBA fans are engaging with NBA broadcasts more actively. The separation softens. And historically, those separations existed for a reason. Different marketing lanes, different narratives, different power structures. Now those lines are blurring. And blurred lines create unpredictability. There's another layer too. Young fans don't carry the same biases older generations did. They didn't grow up treating leagues as isolated universes. They follow players, personalities, energy. And Caitlin Clark speaks directly to that era, which means her influence compounds over time. Because younger viewers aren't debating whether she belongs at the desk. They're asking what she'll say next. That generational shift is quiet, but powerful. And here's the twist no one predicted. The more she succeeds in NBA media spaces, the more it elevates the WNBA brand. Not in a forced way. Not in a corporate campaign way. Organically. Because when an NBA fan sees her break down a defensive rotation flawlessly, they subconsciously upgrade their perception of her league. Respect flows both directions. That's cross-pollination. And cross-pollination increases long-term value. But let's go one level deeper. What happens if her analysis becomes so sharp, so consistent, so widely respected, that she becomes one of the defining voices of modern basketball discussion? Not just women's basketball. Basketball. Period. That's when we move beyond novelty. That's when we enter architecture. Because whoever controls conversation shapes perception. And perception shapes legacy. Now think about this from a business lens. If she continues trending, if her sneaker drops explode, if her broadcast presence grows, if her on-court dominance remains steady, then she isn't just a star. She's a flywheel. Playing success fuels media presence. Media presence fuels endorsements. Endorsements fuel visibility. Visibility fuels playing viewership. And once that cycle gains momentum, it becomes self-sustaining. That's not hype. That's structural leverage. And structural leverage changes ecosystems. Some NBA veterans see opportunity in that. Some executives see expansion. Some traditionalists, they feel the shift. Because for decades, the NBA has been the gravitational center of basketball culture. But gravity shifts when a new object carries enough mass. And Caitlin Clark is accumulating mass quickly. Through performance, through ratings, through strategic positioning, through narrative presence. And if this trajectory continues, we're not looking at a crossover moment. We're looking at a redefinition of who drives the basketball conversation moving forward. But as significant as this tension feels, it might not even be the most important part of the story. Because what she's building isn't just influence inside the current system. It might be a blueprint that changes how athletes operate entirely. And that's where this becomes bigger than NBC. Bigger than ratings. Bigger than sneaker drops. Because the next generation is watching closely. And they're taking notes. And what they're learning could reshape the power structure of sports media for decades. And that's where this story reaches its most fascinating point. At 22 years old, Caitlin Clark may have done something most athletes don't figure out until it's too late. She realized the game isn't just played on hardwood. It's played in narratives. It's played in boardrooms. It's played in broadcast studios. And the ones who control those spaces, they shape how the sport is remembered. For decades, the athlete life cycle followed a predictable pattern. You grind. You dominate. You build your resume. Then, after your body slows down, you pivot into media. Maybe you join a desk. Maybe you start a podcast. Maybe you hope a network gives you a seat. It was linear, safe, sequential. But Caitlin Clark isn't operating linearly. She's operating in parallel. While she's building her professional playing career, she's building media equity. While she's expanding her on-court legacy, she's expanding her off-court leverage. That's rare. Because most athletes don't want to divide focus. They wait. She didn't wait. And that decision changes everything. Because every time she steps onto an NBA broadcast desk, she's doing more than offering analysis. She's gaining reps. She's gaining comfort. She's gaining authority. She's learning the rhythm of live television. She's understanding how narratives are framed. She's studying how conversations are steered. That's invisible experience. And invisible experience compounds. Now fast forward 10 years. If she chooses to extend her media footprint long-term, she won't be auditioning. She'll be established. She won't be transitioning. She'll already be fluent. That's strategic foresight. And it tells you something important. The team around her understands the modern athlete economy. Because today's athlete isn't just competing for championships. They're competing for control. Control of image. Control of timing. Control of message. And the ones who recognize that early, they build empires. Look at the biggest athlete brands of the last 2 decades. They weren't just great players. They were narrative architects. They understood that perception is power. Caitlin Clark is stepping into that lane early. And here's what makes it even more compelling. She didn't manufacture this platform. She earned it through performance. The scoring records were real. The ratings spikes were real. The attendance explosions were real. The viral moments were real. The credibility was built first. Then the media lane opened. That order matters. Because audiences can sense when something is forced. This doesn't feel forced. It feels inevitable. And inevitability is the strongest position in sports. But there's another layer to this blueprint. Young athletes are watching her. High school phenoms, college stars, even NBA rookies. They're observing how she balances dominance with brand building. They're noticing that media presence doesn't have to wait until retirement. They're recognizing that narrative leverage can be built early. That changes future negotiations, future endorsement strategies, future league dynamics. Because if more athletes begin developing broadcast fluency while still playing, networks lose monopoly control over expertise. Players gain autonomy, and autonomy shifts power. That's not a small change. That's generational. Now imagine a future where elite players routinely analyze games across leagues, where league boundaries feel fluid, where fans follow basketball minds more than basketball logos. That's where this is headed. And Caitlin Clark is one of the first modern athletes to fully step into that model while still in her prime. That's why this isn't just about NBC. It's not just about ratings. It's not just about sneaker speculation. It's about infrastructure. She's building long-term infrastructure around herself. And once infrastructure exists, it's very hard to dismantle. But beyond business, beyond leverage, beyond strategy, there's something deeply human happening here. Think about where she started. Des Moines, Iowa. A kid watching games on television, studying movements, imagining moments. Now she's sitting under the brightest lights in basketball, not just playing, but shaping the conversation. Somewhere right now, there's a young athlete watching her do that. And they're realizing something new is possible. That you don't have to fit into old molds. That you don't have to wait your turn. That if your preparation meets opportunity, you can redefine the lane entirely. That's legacy. Not just statistical legacy. Structural legacy. And structural legacies last longer than highlights. When February 1st arrived and the lights came up at Madison Square Garden, it looked like a broadcast debut. It felt like a network relaunch. But beneath the surface, it was something else. It was a signal. A signal that basketball influence no longer lives in one league. A signal that audience loyalty now follows personality more than platform. A signal that the next generation of sports power won't look like the last one. Because when Caitlin Clark sat at that desk, she wasn't asking permission. She wasn't testing the waters. She was stepping into territory that had never fully belonged to someone like her before. And she didn't just survive it. She commanded it. Now the real question isn't whether she belongs in NBA spaces. That debate is already fading. The real question is this. If she continues stacking ratings, building media equity, shaping conversations, and dominating on the court, who controls basketball's narrative 5 years from now? Is it still confined to traditional league hierarchies? Or is it driven by the personalities who move culture across boundaries? Because the most consequential shifts in sports rarely happen during the game. They happen in perception. They happen in positioning. They happen in moments that feel subtle at first, but echo for years. And this might be one of those moments. Not loud, not chaotic, but foundational. So the next time you see Caitlin Clark pull from the logo, or break down a defensive rotation on national television, or trend for something that isn't even a box score, pay attention. Because you might not just be watching a star. You might be watching the blueprint of where basketball power is headed. And if you want to see how this shift unfolds next, if you want breakdowns that go beyond headlines and into what's really changing inside the sport, make sure you subscribe. Because this story, it's just getting started.